heart disease, obviously, and we can go through a list. I'm not trying to leave anybody out, but we don't have time to enumerate all of them. You could add Ebola to that list, right? And we have some promising beginnings. And how do you do that? Well, you're going to have the combination, in this case, primarily of money from the U.S. Treasury paid in there by Wall Street, the people that have been getting a free ride, the people who want to be paying us reparations for having saved their miserable counting houses back in 2008, and some of it also then from the 0% window at the Fed. Now, let's see where things have actually been going on that front. This, I think, is also quite interesting and quite shocking. You know, we just had these austerity battles, right? We had the Tea Party, right? We had Senator Ted Cruz, remember?
Mm-hmm.
So what did that look like? What did that do? I want people, to the extent that we have victims, right? We have people who die from this. I want people to remember who set up a situation where people were going to die. Irresponsible demagogues shooting their mouths off because of their own megalomaniac political ambitions, who took part in wrecking key functions of government. And I want to be very specific. We have the National Institutes of Health here in Bethesda, Maryland, right? The guy that I mentioned at the beginning. Anthony Fauci is the head of the allergies and infectious diseases part of that. He's been around since the AIDS scare crisis began back in the 1980s. And then a dependence of the NIH is the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. That's sort of the more operative, but the NIH is operative also. So right now, the head of the National Institutes of Health is Francis Collins, and this is a famous guy with some scientific merit. He was one side of the race in the 1990s to map the human genome, right? Francis Collins was mapping the human genome through the government agencies, and they made a lot of important progress. And then there was Craig Venter at Celera, very close to where I am now, and they did it in the private sector, right? So that was Celera, right? And somehow between the two, the genome was mapped in the first approximation, at least, by about 2000. They went and were received by Clinton. One of the interesting byproducts was Venter told Clinton, "We have found that there's no such thing as race." That's a very interesting finding. Republicans don't seem to agree with that down to the present day. But now, Collins is therefore not just some little jerk, right? He's somebody with a track record, pluses and minuses, but he's been fighting for scientific progress in his own way. Now, here's a statement from February 2013. This is the effects of sequestration, of killer austerity. I say killer austerity all the time. I say genocidal austerity is what Republicans and Democratic austerity ghouls, Tea Party Republicans and austerity Democrats, that's what they're pushing.
And you know they're promoting the myth that getting sick is your own fault.
What Collins said is that at the beginning of the sequester, that first of all, the National Institutes of Health, his entity, would have to cut $1.6 billion from the budget for fiscal year 2013, under the automatic sequestration cuts. And that is a cut of 5.1% of funds for medical research and other projects. The estimate is that the NIH spends about $6 billion a year, $31 billion over 5 years. But here's the result, and this is what Collins said. In an interview with USA Today, Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, said the United States could lose an entire generation of young scientists if the sequester comes in and people that have fought maybe for years to get grants to begin processes of scientific research, right, with, buying equipment, setting up laboratories, hiring nurses, laboratory assistants, colleagues, and others, right? Mm-hmm. If you then come in and say, sorry, the Tea Party doesn't like you, and we're going to cut you off and let you wither on the vine, then what are they going to say? They're going to say, well, let's try China. Let's try European Union. Let's try the private sector, right? Let's try somebody who's going to gouge the consumers with, we have a pill which is in the area of $800 a pill. This is obviously outrageous, but if you want to have that, then you can do it this way. So the problem is that our ability through the NIH to promote scientific research and to find cures, this has been significantly damaged by this idiotic, reactionary, redneck orgy of austerity and cuts. And as I say killer cuts because they are killer cuts. The story was the Republicans, whenever the Republicans say regulations, they say job-killing regulations. I say, whenever you're talking budget cuts, be honest, say killer cuts. Mm-hmm. Austerity is genocide. So if you're talking austerity, these are genocidal cuts and killer cuts, and they are. You can see it. And I wonder, down there in Texas, right, since this is where the thing began, how many people down there are maybe having second thoughts about their willingness to vote for these redneck reactionaries? I have other words for them, but not now. Maybe you're going to die as a result of the fact that there's no cure for Ebola. Right? So I think people have to take that absolutely.
The mismatch in the amount of money we spend, how much money do we give to Wall Street every month to bail them out versus any of these figures you mentioned?
Now, Nixon, 40 years ago, right? What was it, 1972? Nixon declared a war on cancer. Mm-hmm. Has some continuing positive results. And I think the fact that certain forms of cancer have been significantly reduced over the past several decades has to do with the fact that Nixon at least declared a war on cancer, which meant that there's a special budget for fighting cancer, which goes directly to the president. It has a special status in the budget. And I think it's hard to correlate specific measures with results. But on the whole, over the past 40 years, cancer has taken quite a few serious defeats, right? And there are a lot of people alive today producing and contributing mm-hmm. or just living, right? That's worthwhile too, that have benefited from that. So I think we would need to have this idea of a crash program.
Yeah.
And then they'd say, how much do you want to spend on that? You want to spend as much as you can. Mm-hmm. And here's the problem then. If I decide I want to declare war on Ebola, I'm confronted with a finite number of researchers, a finite number of laboratories, and a finite number of projects that I can fund. And the problem there is I might want to spend $5 billion in a year, but maybe there's just no way I can do that given the number of laboratories, the number of doctors. Maybe I can only spend $1 billion or $2 billion in the first year. And then I have to build up. In other words, I've got to create capacity so that I can spend more and get more in terms of results.
But there's a mythology that's descended on this country, both from the left and the right, that the cancer research industry is worse than cancer itself.
I think this is the voice of the ignorant, backward peasant. And this has not changed from Europe in the 1600s. The notion that doctors are bad people and that it's better to avoid medical care. People that are, some people are afraid of dogs, some people are afraid of loud noises, others are afraid of doctors. It is a reactionary, redneck, backward, rural, peasant outlook. And I think the modern civilized outlook is clearly you want to support medicine, you want to support science. Mm-hmm. And what happened to the longevity, the average life expectancy of a human being over the past 100 years? It's more than doubled, hasn't it? Can that be totally unrelated to modern medicine? Sure, water, I'm all for it. Clean water, we need it. But do you think that's got nothing to do with flu shots or smallpox vaccinations or wiping out polio or whatever it is, right? Now, these are human enterprises, so they can always come and say, yeah, but look, there was corruption here, there was malfeasance there. Yes, human affairs are going to turn out to be like that. But on the whole, what would you rather have? Would you rather face the complications that you might get from a flu shot? Or better yet, how about a diphtheria, tetanus, and whooping cough? How about that one? diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, whooping cough, right? Mm-hmm. You get that shot, there may be some problems, right? But have you ever seen a child die of tetanus or of whooping cough, or seen a person die of one of these other diseases? You never have. And that's, in a sense, that is what skews the modern outlook. They'd say, well, why should I take these shots? I've never had any problems with these diseases. Yes, right.
Well, it's gone as far that most people believe they're putting cancer viruses in the flu vaccines.
Yeah, well, I don't think most people believe that in a million years.
Okay.
I think that's crazy. The clientele of certain right-wing demagogues of the airwaves, maybe they believe that. And I'll tell you where it comes from. If you look at my book, Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America, right, with polygamy, theocracy, and subversion, you'll see that the theory that doctors cause diseases is the theory embraced by that incorrigible enemy of human civilization, Brigham Young, the head of the Mormons, right? The secessionist, the guy who hated Lincoln, hated Grant, hated the United States, a real boiling, bubbling cauldron of hatred and backwardness. You can get that book of mine, and you'll see in there, he says, doctors come in, doctors create the diseases, and then doctors create money by pretending to cure the diseases. So if you want to be in the same boat with that, and of course, since that's Utah, right, this entire Mormon area, that's a mass of backwardness which has weighed on the whole history of the United States. But maybe, look, in the couple of minutes we have, maybe a couple of words about what should be done right now, because all the things that I've talked about are relatively long-range things. I would say, first of all, the federal government ought to gear up resources. For example, it's clear the Texas Department of Health doesn't work. How could it work, right? Texas is the state that has the lowest level of insurance of any state in the United States, right? That's the free market, libertarian paradise of Governor Rick Perry. And lo and behold, a large proportion of the people don't have medical care, and therefore you get this, absurd chaos of what went on in Dallas. And it may not be any better anywhere else, but you figure that Texas is going to be one of the most vulnerable points. So I would say the federal government has to realize that their system could be overwhelmed. When you see Fauci and others come on television, they say, as long as we have individuals coming into the United States, we can carry out contact tracing and we can follow all of those cases. And that's fine as long as it's a very limited number of contacts of people coming in. But as soon as that begins to multiply, you will outrun your resources. So at that point, you've got to think about quarantine. And quarantine means you would go and get some nice hotels, right, out in the countryside, and you would say, this is going to be quarantine. And all quarantine ever means is restrictions on the movements and behavior of people. And in Texas, we find the family in question they were told, stay indoors and don't go out. And they said, no, we're not going to do that, right? Well, why do we want to be cooped up? Well, unfortunately, at that point, the interests of the collectivity, yes, of the modern state, have to kick in. You have to say, sorry, we have a nice, we'll take you to the Greenbrier here, or Warm Springs, or whatever it is.
They did this during Boccaccio's
Yes,
Decameron.
in other words, what you need to do is it was done with tuberculosis, right? Your tuberculosis sanitarium. It means that you've got to have a place that is clean, that has tremendously good nutrition, medical services on call, and the people are going to sit there for a week or two, probably at public expense, and sit there, and if they develop the symptoms, then they're sick, and if they don't, they can go home, and they can stay in their own rooms, right? So that's sort of the quarantine question.